Hello, my noble band of outlaws. Outlaw Samurai coming at you live with a video. Well, this is going to be my first ever solo movie review without Geekapedea. The movie in question is The Last Voyage of the Demeter. Now, The Last Voyage of the Demeter is actually based off of one chapter from Bram Stoker's Dracula. In this movie, we are opening to a ship known as the Demeter coming to a Transylvanian port. These Transylvanians are loading up Dracula and 50 coffins full of cargo that a private benefactor had bought in England. Well, the Demeter is also searching for a crew while in port. They are 3 men short. The main character, Mr. Clemens, I'm not sure of the actor who played him, but Mr. Clemens is played by a black man, and that will come into context later on in the video. Disclaimer, I am going to be discussing some sensitive topics in this review because some sensitive topics were brought up in the Demeter, at least by today's standards. Now, as Mr. Clemens applies for the position of ship's doctor, he is denied. And it's not because of the color of his skin, it's because the first mate does not believe that Mr. Clemens actually does know anything about being on a ship. So he opts to take a Romanian man instead. Well, as they are loading the cargo, the Romanian sees the symbol of a dragon on one of the large coffins that is being loaded onto the ship. Well, he decides to freak out, causing the crate that they are currently loading to be unstable and almost crush the captain of the Demeter's grandson, who is playing beneath it. Mr. Clemens ends up being able to save the captain's grandson, and the Romanian man says, "You mentioned nothing about dragons." Now, in Romanian mythology, dragons are associated with Satan and evil. And Dracula is said to have used the dragon as his symbol. Both his historical counterpart, Vlad the Impaler, and his spiritual counterpart, Strigoi, which the Strigoi is where all of our classic vampire myths kind of come from. At least those that involve the Romanian vampires. Historians believe that the Egyptian god Sekhmet was actually the first quote-unquote vampire legend recorded in human history. Though I digress. So after Mr. Clemens saves the boy from being crushed by the crate, the captain and the first mate offer him the position of ship's doctor. Well, everything is going fine until one night Now, everything is going fine. That very night, everyone is singing, they're dancing, they're drinking, they're having a merry old time. And I do like this scene for the simple fact it's the calm before the storm. I believe all horror movies should have a calm before the storm scene. Basically foreshadowing that none of these guys are going to survive except for Mr. Clemens. Spoiler alert. In any case, as Mr. Clemens continues to interact with the ship and the captain's grandson, we enter a dinner scene where Mr. Clemens is asked by the captain of the ship what his dreams are, and he simply says, "For the world to make sense." Now, keep in mind that this is also foreshadowing another very important detail, considering that this is the 18th century and our main character is a black man. And I know what this is alluding to, and you would be partially correct. But in any case, as everyone is going about their daily business, they start to notice strange happenings around the ship. Especially, as I mentioned before, the one night where the cargo shifts and they find a Romanian girl. Now, this Romanian girl is fighting a disease, which is actually vampirism. Now, once they find this Romanian girl, Mr. Clemens gives her blood transfusions. Keep in mind that this takes place in 1897. So, blood transfusions are a newer science in medical treatments. They no longer consider bloodletting and leeches as medically sound. Again, 18th century. But in any case, uh, as Mr. Clemens is treating the girl, we find that the Dracula is starting to feed on other sources. She was brought along with Dracula as a source of food. But now that she is no longer in the cargo hold with Dracula, he's starting to feed on other things. Presumably, he begins to feed on the rats that are in the hull, and then moves on to the livestock. Now, at first, they begin to think that the dog, which they had a dog, his name was Huckleberry, they believed that Huckleberry had contracted rabies, and then began to slaughter the rest of the animals. However, Huckleberry himself was also mutilated. So the captain asked Mr. Clemens if the disease was able to be transmitted. And if you know anything about diseases, you know that rabies can only be transmitted through to humans via biting by an infected animal. And he as much says this. I like how they actually do have historical realism and just don't immediately say it's the devil or demon work or witchcraft or sorcery. Though I wouldn't be too surprised if they did. In any case, Mr. Clemens tells them that they have to throw all the infected meat overboard, meaning that they have essentially lost at least a quarter of their food supply, and now must resort to eating nothing but the vegetables and broths that are left over. Now, after this occurs, we get the first sign of, for lack of a better word, racism. It's not straight out untastefully done. The way it's done in this movie is not in a bigotry sense, where it's very apparent. The way it's done in this movie is actually, in my opinion, much more tactfully done than other movies have portrayed it. And the first scene we see this in is actually with another Russian mate, is actually with another Russian on the ship. A confirmed Russian that is not the first mate. In this scene, he says there are only two people I have not sailed with on this ship before. He says a Russian word which I assume either means woman, bitch, or whore. I'm not familiar. I think it was like Shaska, not like the sword Shaska, like it was a different pronunciation. And then he calls Mr. Clemens a darky. And Mr. Clemens basically says, say that again. And they almost get into an altercation until I believe either the Romanian sailor, or the first mate, one of the two breaks them up. And justifiably, the Russian is the first one to get killed. Which, I had no love for him after he said that. Personally, I wanted to see him die pretty much immediately, and I got my wish. He was killed and fed on by Dracula. Now, as the movie progresses and more members of the ship fall to Dracula, each crew, one by one, gets killed. Dracula basically starts to mutilate the crew. And by the end of the movie, only Mr. Clemens and the Romanian girl are left over. And they manage to temporarily defeat Dracula by causing the ship's mass to crush him. Now, The other scene which I said would come into context is actually where Mr. Clemens is explaining his backstory to the first mate. He tells Mr. Clemens tells the first mate that he was one of the first black men to ever graduate from Cambridge University in London. And if you don't know what Cambridge University is, it is basically the English equivalent to Harvard or Yale here in the United States. And as he was one of the first black men to graduate, he immediately started to seek employment in the medical field. However, unfortunately, this is the 18th century, so what I'm about to say isn't out of context for the historical accuracy here. They kept telling him that he was denied because the position had already been filled to every hospital that he applied to. Until finally, somehow his name got to the Romanian king, the king of Romania at the time, and so he was given passage to Romania. However, while his name had reached the Romanian king, according to Mr. Clemens, the color of his skin did not. And I'm paraphrasing direct quotes from the movie. And I felt like this was tastefully done. It wasn't thrown in our face. The movie had a slight subplot building up to it. And it explains why Mr. Clemens was in Romania and why he was so eager to return to London. Now, don't get me wrong. While the message was delivered fine, I'm not entirely okay with it being mentioned at all. Personally speaking, with the way the world is going now, we already have to deal with enough of that shoved into our faces. I really don't want to see it in movies. Now, you could obviously tell me don't watch the movie, but I had just watched it and had no prior knowledge of the movie at the time before watching it. And I'm picking my words very carefully here as not to enrage anyone. But the fact of the matter is, I do actually like the way they portrayed Mr. Clemens' story. It's believable and historically accurate to the time period that he was in, and that the movie takes place in. And it's refreshing to see that not every quote-unquote white character in the setting of this movie thinks the same way. Not everyone in that era was racist. That's something that not a lot of movies portray. Me, myself, I like to consider myself a blind man. I judge based on your character, the sweat of your brow, and the strength of your back. The way my father taught me, and the way my entire family raised me. To me, color is inconsequential to who you are. Which is why I'm also tired of all these, I guess, woke crap. I say, judge people by who they are, not by what they look like. That's just fucking stupid. But in any case, the way that this movie does it is actually very tasteful and tactile in the way that it delivers it. The way Mr. Clemens delivers his backstory makes us realize that he had struggled through the adversities of the time and still managed to succeed in gaining his degree, gaining the medical knowledge he needed to become a doctor. It's just the bigotry of the time would not allow him to practice. So I very much like how they handled that sensitive topic in the movie. It was there and it was crucial to plot development to an extent, but it wasn't completely thrown in our face the entire movie. And afterwards, the first mate gains a much greater respect for Mr. Clemens as they plan to sink the ship and Dracula with them before they reach the coast of England. Now, with the basic story and some of the controversial stuff out of the way, I will give my honest opinion. 7.5 out of 10 is what I would have to rate this movie. And it's not because of the biases, I should say. It's because it's predictable. And what do I mean by predictable? Well, all the jump scares and Dracula attacks, honestly, I could see coming a mile away. The moment that the Romanian man is turned into a vampire lackey and he chases the young grandson of the captain into the captain's cabin, which, for those of you who don't know, 18th century maritime law, the captain of a ship has his own distinct cabin, usually at the back of the ship underneath the steering wheel, while the crew has either have to sleep either in or directly above the cargo hold in the crew's quarters. And points for the historical accuracy of the ship. But in any case, he is chased into the captain's cabin, where Dracula is inside the cabin. It alluded that Dracula has been inside the cabin the entire time, or at least the majority of the time, after the boy first leaves to check on a noise he hears. Well, we later learn that Dracula was actually rationing his food supply, or the people on the ship, limiting himself to one of the crew members a night until they got closer to London, where he no longer had to ration and he could gorge himself on as much of their blood as he saw fit. Now, aside from the very predictable jump scares and attacks, I also have to deduct a point for the Romanian girl not knowing how to deal a fatal blow to Dracula. I get it that he's been terrorizing your village for centuries, but your people are the ones who first invented the legend of the Strigoi and how to kill it and defeat them, which is classic Bram Stoker Dracula, holy water, stake through the heart, garlic. Okay, you're telling me you didn't even know, like, a stake through the heart? They didn't even make one mention of silver as a weakness either. I mean, we see a wolf's head cane in Dracula's coffin when we finally find when Mr. Clemens and the Romanian girl finally find it. But I expected them to find like a silver spike or some kind of note or letter depicting how to kill Dracula, or at least how to critically wound him. I mean, they make the assumption that Dracula runs from bullets so that he can be killed, but the only reason he's running from the bullets is probably because I want to say he doesn't know if they're silver or not. See, I don't think Dracula knows that these people don't know his weaknesses, but I want to assume that Dracula believes that they have silver bullets, or at least bullets that have been blessed with holy water or something, because he's used to having to fight people that come prepared to fight him. He's not used to fighting people that aren't prepared, so I want to assume this Dracula incarnation is very tactful in his thinking, very tactical. However, as the movie does progress, Dracula eventually gets stronger and stronger until we see him in the final form of the movie. He's able to enunciate his words without any kind of monstrous jaw. He has large wings that sprout from his armpits to the tips of his elongated fingers. He has giant bat ears, and he has a jaw full of razor-sharp stabbing teeth. And Mr. Clemens basically calls Dracula out, telling him to square up, which was the most badass moment in the movie. He says, "You are not a god, you are not a mighty deity at all. You feed, you sleep, you hide. You are of mortal flesh and you can be killed. Basically, is what he says, and I do not fear you. Dracula grabs him by the neck, makes a small claw mark on it, and says, "You will fear me." Which was a badass moment on its own. And as we see Dracula slowly bringing Mr. Clemens closer and closer and opening his jaw to feed on the blood, the Romanian girl actually cuts one of the mizzenmast ropes, causing one of the masts to swing around the ship and pin Dracula to the main mizzenmast. For those of you who don't know, and I'm pretty sure this is the correct nautical term, a mizzenmast is the big main mast of a sailing ship. The big telephone-looking thing that the crow's nest sits on top of. Well, after this, the ship then crashes into the English countryside. The constables are alerted by the lighthouse keeper, and basically the whole movie is the constable reading the captain's log. Up until the final scenes where we see Dracula and Mr. Clemens basically fighting each other, and then when they're in London, we see Dracula basically taunting Mr. Clemens to come after him, and it alludes to a massive fight at the end of the movie, but we don't get to see that because then it cuts to end credits. I mean, it leaves it open in case they want to make a sequel to this, or they want to make an entire Bram Stoker Dracula remake. Which I was honestly surprised that DreamWorks had anything to do with this. Though, I think because DreamWorks had something to do with this, and they don't usually make horror movies, I was able to tell what the jump scares were like that. Like, oh, Dracula's there. Oh, Dracula's there. Oh, he's going to come behind you. I was literally calling everywhere the Dracula was attacking from. I may even do a video how to fight this particular incarnation of Dracula as like one of my indoor winter videos. For those of you who don't know, I tend to make more random videos during winter to fill in content than cutting videos or anything like that. Or even sword reviews for that matter. But in any case, I can't really give this a 10 out of 10 because really my major gripes come from predictable attack scenes, lack of vampire lore, and the simple fact is there was not enough gore to satisfy me. Sure, the killings were bloody, but they were pretty damn tame compared to a lot of other vampire media. I mean, the closest we got to a gory scene was just seeing the aftermath of the bite marks of Dracula's victims. Personally, I would have liked to have seen a lot more gore, perhaps maybe have the throats gashed out, or Dracula rips one of the crew members' heads off, lifts his body up and starts drinking the blood that comes out of the severed neck like he was chugging a cherry Pepsi or some shit. I don't know. It's just the gore. It's just those four things weren't there to really make this a 10 out of 10 vampire movie for me. So, with that in mind, I hope you've enjoyed this review of the last voyage of the Demeter. I will be putting in the description, warning, sensitive material will be discussed as a means of avoiding any potential certain claims to be made about me. But in any case, that I have no evidence, that there is no evidence of supporting, but aside from that. Until next time, my noble band of outlaws, outlaw samurai, tells all y'all be crazy rednecks, be safe and use your weapons, and I may be doing more movie reviews in the future if this is received well. I'm out. Peace.